So I want to say good morning and good afternoon to everyone. We have participation, in fact, across continents. We are indeed very, very happy to be welcoming you all, and I thank you very much for giving from your time to join us on this occasion. Um, Today our topic is gardens, which seems to be just one single concept, but in fact, the more we look into it and with the expertise of all the scholars who will be taking part as speakers at this symposium, we see that gardens in fact stretch across so many different levels of meanings. We are at the same time touching upon economics, international trade, aesthetics, subsistence, food. So many different aspects will be coming into our focus. This session, in fact, is part of a two-day symposium organized by the Sociology Department of Beykent University. The symposium was entitled Health, Ecology and Food During the Anthropocene. So we've been having in the morning and all tomorrow, we will be having sessions conducted in Turkish, but this is our very valuable international session. And we are very lucky that you are able to come and share your scholarly work and ideas on this subject. Now, my personal interest, academic research interest in gardens began when we were carrying out a nationwide research on forest villages across Turkey. And the objective of this research was to understand how present-day villagers relate to the forest and to the trees. And they have been designated as forest villages, which is an administrative understanding. And in fact, my former student and present colleague, Gizem İdrisoğlu, she's the one who, in a way, opened my eyes to the importance of gardens. She was situated doing ethnographic work in a village garden of in a village, forest village of Istanbul. And this village was really making a lot of profit from the forest. Even despite this, as we were talking with her, for nearly a month, she kept talking, saying how important the garden was, that she had been spending time in the garden. And it took her a month to go out into the forest. And of course, in this particular village, the forest and the garden, they are more gendered spaces where women spend more time and do more work in the garden, whereas men tend to go and work out in the forest. But she kept talking about how people are proud of the products in the garden, of all the vegetables they are growing. They invite each other for displays, for shows. They spend a lot of time, and so do their children in the garden. So this gradually made me realize how important the garden was for these villagers, even though they were making most of their economic gains out of the forest and through other ways. And even though their gardens were much smaller in size compared to their own fields, still the garden was very, very central, especially in the lives of women. So this was one eye-opener for me. And then, of course, recently, for the past year, when we had this pandemic touching our lives, suddenly all across Turkey, urban Turkey, the prices of dwellings with gardens rocketed really high. People have been renting houses that have gardens so that their children and themselves, they can go out and enjoy some fresh air. So this runs quite contrary to all the tall buildings we have been building across urban Turkey. So this was another, I think, quite significant point. And of course, the picture with gardens, it's quite complex. We can approach it from very different ways. And here now at this introductory welcoming point, I will not be talking much more, but I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Sir Roderick Floud, who has kindly agreed to talk about gardens, the history of gardens, the economic history of gardening in the United Kingdom. I was very impressed with his book, and I must admit that some years back when we were together at the European Science Foundation, he was the head of the social sciences there, and when I learned that he was writing a book on gardens, I did not think that it would be so economically detailed and specifying so many numbers, figures, and tightly bringing in issues that are of even international trade and relations. So I would like to now leave the floor to you, Sir Floud, and please, if you would talk about your research and your findings.
Thank you very much, Akili. Let me just try to play the screen, play slideshow. Right, is that okay? You can see the title?
Yes, this is very good. This is very
well, thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to give the keynote address to your conference and to meet you again, if not in person. I'm very sorry, like others, I'm sure, that not to be in Istanbul, although perhaps not if there's a lockdown starting this evening, but it's a town that I've visited often with great pleasure. I'm looking forward to hearing the other speakers today, so I'm going to be as brief as I can be. I want to argue today that we should view the garden not only as a place for hobby and recreation, not only as a metaphor, not only as a place of display for kings and emperors, not only for all the reasons you've just specified, but as a great industry. In my country, the United Kingdom, about half the adult population are gardeners. And time use studies show that actually, although the British think of themselves as the great gardening nation, many other European countries spend more time, their populations spend more time on gardening than they do in the United Kingdom. And in the United States, which after all has much more challenging gardening conditions than most European countries, 78% of homeowners are regular gardeners. Now, why is gardening so popular? Most important, I think it's because people enjoy it. That's again shown in all kinds of surveys and has been shown in surveys throughout the 20th century, in fact. But it's also good for them, as we may be hearing later. A recent survey for the Royal Horticultural Society in the UK showed that gardening was as good for physical and mental health as other forms of exercise, such as jogging or swimming, and that it in general improved people's well-being. Now, it's not surprising, therefore, if gardening is seen in so many different ways, as you've mentioned, Akili, that it takes in so many different topics, from botany to landscaping, from chemistry to the history of art and design. And I think they're all each in their own way, valid methods of looking at a hugely popular human activity. We're going to hear about several of them today, so I hope you'll forgive me if I focus on my own specialism, the economics and economic history of gardening, and illustrate it with some examples from the United Kingdom. My interest in this topic goes back quite a long time, but began with a very simple question, which I asked as I wandered around a beautiful garden. And the question was, this is really lovely, but how much did it cost? You may think that is rather a sad question to ask, but it's one that economists and economic historians do quite often ask. But what I found was that none of the thousands of books on gardening or garden history none of the guidebooks to the Great English Gardens, even none of the books in my own discipline answered that question or even asked it. So I set out to answer it for myself, and this book, which you see the penguin version of, the paperback version of, it's about to be published in the United States under a different title, England's Magnificent Gardens. But as I wrote this book, did the research for it, it became clear to me that I was writing the history of an important English industry. And I will speculate that it's an important industry in most other countries of the world. So what are the main features of that industry? The first is that it's big but neglected. It's big in the UK, for example. The garden industry is worth at least £11 billion a year of the gross domestic product. That's spent on 19 million private gardens and on thousands of public parks and open spaces. And it's been like this for centuries. This isn't a modern phenomenon, at least in my country. It may even have been a larger proportion of gross domestic product in the past, when more was spent on public parks and on the wages of gardeners. I don't know the size of the garden industry in other countries, although people keep asking me that question, but and I hope that this will stimulate others to do the work, but I guess that the same can be said of many other countries. So a very big industry. But even £11 billion is an underestimate. And that's because two crucial figures are left out of it. The first is that the labor that we put into gardening and the value of that. That is not counted because it's not paid for in the definitions of gross domestic product. It's not counted in that way. Nor do we count the value of the land that we use, which in my country, where land is now becoming more and more expensive, is again a question of probably hundreds of billions of pounds. So that we greatly underestimate the economic significance of gardens. And governments fail to appreciate the importance of gardening to their populations and their economies. And this is very paradoxical because the state has actually been very important in creating the gardening industry. So if I move on first to the role of the state and go back 350 years, this shows you the expenditure on royal palaces, parks and gardens of the three last Stuart kings and queens between 1660 and 1701. And you can see in the third column the equivalent annual spending today. This is on, as I say, on palaces, parks and gardens, but we know that about a third of that expenditure actually goes on gardens. And if you add it all up, you find that the three monarchs were spending between £1 and £1.5 billion on their gardens in London in the last 40 years of the 17th century. But then it continued. Tens of millions of pounds were spent each year during the 18th century, both on building new gardens and maintaining those gardens. And that level of expenditure continued right through the 19th and 20th centuries and has continued even today. This is what was created as a result of that expenditure. The royal parks of London, there are a few missing which are further out from this map, and they cost together about £27 million a year to maintain. There's not much garden building going on at the moment. So this is really the maintenance costs. And that seems to have been the case, as I say, since the end of the 17th century. So the state is very important to gardens, but where the kings and queens led, the aristocracy of England followed. There were about 400 to 500 estates of at least 10,000 acres, 5,000 hectares in 18th century England, all of whom had to have a very large garden. One of them, for example, is Rest Park in north of London. I call it paradise because, as you probably know, the word for a garden in many languages is paradiso or paradise. And the English aristocracy were creating paradise at great expense and very frequently with money from the state. This particular beautiful garden, not quite my favorite, but one of my top three, I think, of English landscape gardens, was created by Henry Grey, 12th Earl and 1st Duke of Kent, who held a large number of appointments at the royal court and was paid for them about 30 million pounds in modern values. And some of that, he had a pretty lavish lifestyle, but some of that was used to pay for the great garden at Rest Park, which probably cost about 40 million pounds to create between 1660 and 1760, and a further £750,000 each year to maintain. Now, where did the money go to? Well, some of it went to the most famous of English landscape gardeners, Lancelot Capability Brown. He's been said, or his landscape gardens have been said, I think rather exaggerated form, to be England's greatest contribution to European culture. If that's so, he certainly did well out of it for himself. We don't think of gardeners as being well paid, but designers and nurserymen are sometimes a different matter. Brown's accounts show that he was responsible for projects worth about £1 billion in modern values during his career, of which about £150 million was profit. And his predecessor, Henry Wise, another royal gardener and partner in the great Brompton Park nursery of the late 17th century, made as much, if not more, as did Joseph Paxton in the 19th century. And numerous nurserymen became millionaires in modern terms. Seedsmen, for reasons I don't fully understand, did even better. So why was so much money spent? How was so much money spent? The answer is that gardens, particularly the bigger ones, are very large engineering and architectural projects and have to be seen that way. Building dams, moving huge quantities of soil. This is Paynes Hill in the outskirts of London, created by the Honourable James Hamilton in the middle of the 18th century. The lake, part of which you can see here, is 14 acres. It lies 3 meters higher than the adjoining river, which feeds the water supply. So Hamilton had to have a pumping system, originally with a horse, to fill the lake. But apart from the lake, he has tree-lined alpine valleys, flower gardens, there's an Elysian plain, there are temples, there's a Chinese bridge, and a hermit's hut where there was apparently briefly a real hermit. But one feature of Paynes Hill, as of a number of other great gardens, is the grotto, entirely artificial, on an island lined with a variety of sparkling minerals, with wooden pillars embedded with crystals to form the stalactites. And it cost the grotto alone about £14 million in modern values. But the engineering didn't stop with lakes and dams. There were the buildings, and in particular the greenhouses. This is Paxton's Great Stove at Chatsworth, preceding his even larger Crystal Palace of 1851, which in fact became essentially a greenhouse when it was moved after 1851 to South London. And other large greenhouses were built at Kew, for example, and in the gardens of the wealthy across England. And this is important because these are the precursors of the glass and steel skyscrapers which fill our cities today. There's a direct descent from these buildings to the way in which we build so much today. But there are other industries which were stimulated by, apart from architecture, apart from building, which were stimulated by gardening. This is John Evelyn's greenhouse of 1691. And this is the first example in England that we know about of central heating. Central heating, which has certainly transformed much of Northern Europe, or the comfort of people in Northern Europe, began with greenhouses applied to plants, not to people. It took about a century at least before it was applied to people. So another new industry created as a result of the garden. And then, of course, there are the innovations in plant breeding pioneered by the botanical gardens, which flourished in Britain and other countries from the 17th century onwards, just to take one example. So gardening has been responsible for the creation of a great industry, of technological innovations, large enterprises with numbers of workers rivaling those of any better known industries, and it's made people wealthy. But I have to end with one of my other favorite gardens, Stour Head, as an epitome of the creation of beauty. Gardening and garden visiting is something that people enjoy, and a very important part of our culture and of our cultural heritage. It isn't usually thought of as a cultural industry like the theatre or the cinema, but in fact, it should be seen as that. And it engages far more people than any sport. People get terribly excited about football, but gardening dwarfs football in terms of numbers of participants and people enjoying it. It deserves far more attention as a central part of our economy and our society. My work on the economic history of gardens has taken me to amazing places in the UK and abroad, and have reinforced a passion for gardens and gardening, which I share with hundreds of millions of men and women and children around the world. And I'm sure you all share that passion, or will come to do so. And I look forward very much to hearing more about the research into what the great English poet Rudyard Kipling called the glory of the garden. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Sir Flood. This was really, to me, it strikingly put across that gardens, apart from their beauty, as you say, it doesn't only have plants and flowers and trees, but also all the water involved in it, all the architectural efforts that go into it. Now, because of time limitations, I would have asked our discussant, Huri Cihan, to step in, but we will be hearing Mr. Barbaros Fergus Garrett. He has some very, I know, interesting insights into horticulture and what he's doing now, managing the Great Dixter House and Gardens. So I will give the floor to you. And Mr. Garrett, he was born in Istanbul, so he's both Turkish and I think he's in 2 countries.
Thank you, Akila Hanım. Real pleasure to be amongst you, and fascinating talk by Sir Roderick Floud, and we're right in the middle of this industry. We are one of the main employers in our area, and we are a small garden, but we turn over near enough £2 million a year and give employment to up to 70 families in our area, and have visits from all over the world. So I'm going to talk to you about the things that are important as far as we are concerned as a hub in our area, and show you the beauty of this garden, because gardens are where the natural world, where artistry and creativity, where history, as we've just heard, food, science, education, culture and community come together, as well as providing employment and providing that central place in our community. But our tentacles reach out across the world, and What I want to do is just show you a lot of images very quickly to show you the excitement and joy and dynamism a place like Great Dixter brings. As well as that, it's been proven through our recent studies that it's actually one of the richest pockets of biodiversity in our area. In fact, it's richer than all the wild land around us for all the sort of species that we've got, because of the intensive borders that have a long season of food, but also the buildings and all the different environments that we've created there that give us the diversity of insects and the life attached to it. So this photograph shows you Great Dixter Gardens compartmentalized into a series of rooms. It's a very charming and romantic and atmospheric place. It's over 100 years old, so the vegetation is in a way taken over, and that creates a certain softness to it. So from one season to another, it's got its own feel. Even the winter season has its characteristics and its feel as well. We are open to the public, and we're unusual in the sense that people have to walk through this almost wild land to get to the front door. So it's a garden where it allows the countryside to flow into it and have that handshake with it. And in terms of our wildish areas within the garden, like these wildflower meadows, they're also a place where we support some quite rare species, including bees like the longhorn bee. In fact, this small garden has over 130 species of bee in it, which is, if you take the total population of bees or total numbers of bee species in the United Kingdom, that's near enough half the UK bee species. So it's extraordinarily diverse. As well as that, things like these terrestrial orchids of all sorts are just make a matrix through all our planting. And all of this adds a certain charm and atmosphere, but the whole place is alive. So it appeals not only to garden lovers, but it's appealing now to ecologists and people who are interested in wildlife as well. And Great Dixter is unusual in many ways in that the formal rubs shoulders with the informal, and there's that strange juxtaposition. So we have this magnificent 15th century manor house that was renovated by Sir Edwin Lutyens, who was a leader in the arts and crafts movement, with those highly intensive, colourful borders. Then we've got mown grass, long grass, and it bleeds out to the countryside that follows it. And it's a charming, romantic flower garden. So vegetation engulfs the business. It's, if you like, it's of the cottage garden style. It's on the steps going up onto the terraces, and our terraces look like this. And this vegetation changes from one week to another. So if you look at this dry stone wall along the back of the garden, that same wall 5 weeks later looks like that, with the vegetation coming through it. So within that sort of, and then it changes again to that. So and within that formal structure that we have of the buildings and all the clipped yews and the clipped hedges, you've got that lovely, joyous, dynamic garden that's got a touch of the wild to it, but there's flowers, one lot of flowers after another lot of flowers that come through, and all of that is surrounded by the countryside that's around it. So our paths can look like this, with wild flowers that embrace the more exotic ones in the beds, so that we see a scene like this, which is almost, with cow parsley and oxeye daisies, is almost sort of a hint of the hedgerow flora that you see around us. But then this scene within a few weeks changes to that, and then it will change again into another set of displays, because we are a display garden. We are very keen on our color and our plant combinations. So, and our borders look good over a long season. At the moment, the borders are glorious with tulips. And then as the tulips finish, the borders will look like this. So this is a shot in May. This is June. It changes again, that border. And this is July. And from July, it changes in August. And then it changes again in September and in October, where we've got bright color like this. So that season goes on. And having that long season in the garden means that we can attract visitors over a long period as well. And because the garden changes regularly in terms of this dynamic planting that we've got, the same visitor comes back one season after another. And because we experiment with our planting, that same visitor may come 1 year after another as well. So there's this ongoing support on a garden like that. And then we go quiet over the winter and we choose to close the garden over the winter months. So we may have a tropical garden like this, which the following year could look like that as we change the vegetation in it. And then it changes again the following year, so that you're going from an image like this 1 year as the visitor goes into it, and then you see something that's quite different the following year, and then it changes again to that, and then it changes again. So we're experimenting with our planting as if you're doing new paintings all the time. And that keeps the garden fresh for us, but also it keeps those visitors going. So we're all about these sort of floral displays that look like this, that look like that look like this, that go on to look like that, using wild plants and common plants and rare plants in together. And foliage and textures of leaves are important to us. And so a scene like that will change to a scene like this before all the yellows and the reds and the blues and the whites come in the main planting. And even in our pot displays, you know, we play around with green in our pot displays, and that same pot display, when it flowers, does that. So the visitor may see it like that and enjoy it, come back in about 2 weeks later, and see it again. So we've got these friends of Dixter and annual ticket holders that come into this garden on a regular basis. And it's all about painting pictures for us, to creating these sort of landscapes that change and embrace, and from one season to another. This is what it looks like now. And as you walk through the paths, you've got tulips either side of you, and then you move on to the next bit of display and the next bit of display. All of it is quite joyous and dynamic and colorful and refreshing. But along with that comes, you know, the economic support that we give to the area, the employment that we give through the connection that we have across the world with garden lovers, the experiments that we do, the way we embrace ecologists and scientists and historians, all those people in together, as well as this astonishing result that came from 1 year of studies of nearly 2,200 species of invertebrate in the garden. You know, 100 species of lichen, over 140 species of bee, over 400 species of macro moth. So our lead ecologist, who was anti-gardens, who came into to Great Dixter, said it was one of the richest sites he's surveyed in his 30 years of surveying. So with about, I think it's perhaps 580,000 hectares of garden in the UK. If you add all of those spaces together with the roadside birches, with the towns and cities, in terms of supporting a degree of biodiversity which is declining, gardens can play a big part in that as well. So that's my end of my very quick talk, Akila Hanum. So I just wanted to convey that message of how an exciting bit of work a garden can be, in terms of not only for the gardens but for the community that's around us. And that's the picture that sums it all up.
Thank you very much. This is so beautifully, poetically put across. I think we would all have liked to be there, not just once, but throughout the year. And it's definitely a work of art, and from a heartful work. Many congratulations, and thank you very much for coming to join us now. So because of time limitations, I would like to move on. Now we have again a very interesting presentation coming from Daniel Keach, who is a cultural geographer. I hope, Barbaros Bey, you can stay on and be with us as much as you can, as much as your meetings will allow. Daniel Keach, he's from the University of Gloucestershire in the United Kingdom, and he will be talking about urban horticulture and rural identity in the World Heritage City of Bamberg.
Thank you very much, Akile. Let me just get started up. Can everybody see my slides?
Yes.
Great, thank you very much.
Visible, right.
Great. I'm glad I'm high up the ranking. It's already becoming quite hard to follow some of these amazing discussions that we are opening up here today. Mindful of the time, Akile, I'll rush straight in, but I just want to say thank you very quickly. Firstly, to you for inviting us to participate. It's a real pleasure, and I'm glad to be here with my colleague Matt Reed, who's also speaking later on. We're very excited about joining in today. I also want to thank Marcel. I want to say "Dziękuję wam" to Marcel for helping us get ready for this. And then lastly, as you can see in this first slide here, I really want to emphasize my collaboration with Professor Mark Riedepenning at the Otto Friedrich University in Bamberg, from whom I've stolen some of these very nice pictures that we'll be discussing today. So I want to make three main points really in this presentation. And the first one is that there's been this huge upsurge in scholarship on gardening. Of course, you know, Sir Roderick, you've mentioned that it's a very old area of scholarship in some respects, but I want to emphasize that there's been an upsurge in scholarship on urban gardening as a kind of post-industrial civil society innovation in response to a range of quite urgent contemporary concerns. For example, questions such as, is urban gardening an answer to food security? And particularly, is that the case in global and rapidly growing megacities? Even so, in many smaller cities, commercial urban horticulture is an ongoing and long-standing tradition. And the picture here shows the German city of Bamberg as a case in point, where about 20 family-run businesses continue a practice over about 4 hectares in the very center of the city, which has its roots in the 14th century. Starting, by the way, in the monastery that you can see on the far hill. My second point relates to methods and themes used in studying urban gardens, and really exciting studies by well-known geographers and sociologists in particular in recent years have focused on issues such as food security and climate resilience, community cohesion and community integration, as well as power relations and governance of the urban food chain through the lens of urban horticulture and urban agriculture. And I'm sure Matt will cover some of those issues later. But instead, Mark and I have been captivated by issues including cultural structures and cultural institutions, because particularly in Bamberg, and we also did comparative work with Bath, the city of Bath in England, but I haven't got time to talk about Bath today. So Mark and I were interested in Bamberg gardens because they are part of the World Heritage designation of that city. And the gardens that we can see before us now are really run by 2 ancient and male-dominated fraternities that have a key role in upholding the tradition of gardening and partly the traditional identity of the city. So we've used culture as a different way into studying urban horticulture. And Akile, you know, I was interested in your reports on gender roles, and there's a whole nother presentation and conversation we could have there around Bamberg that I would welcome one day. So moving on, here's a picture, here's a map of the city of Bamberg. Oh, sorry, I hadn't made my last point. I said I was going to make 3 points, and my third point was simply that, you know, the cultural way into studying urban gardens also tells us a lot about how gardens contribute to the physical fabric, the spatial layout, and the formation of what I want to emphasize as rural identities in the city. So to help us do that, let's have a look at the map in front of us. This is from 1602 and is from the city archives in Bamberg. And in the yellow framed area, you can see the lower gardeners' quarter. There's also an upper gardeners' quarter just to the south of it. But we'll concentrate on the lower gardeners for now. And of course, within it, you can see the cultivated fields and the medieval city origins just there to the west. And further to the west on the edge of the picture, you can see lots of orchards and vineyards as well. Now, let's continue and look at this picture, which is from the 1930s. And really the street structure and the gardening structure is pretty much unchanged. Now let's just fast forward a bit more, and this is 2017. And again, you can see the principal transport arteries and settlement patterns again are unchanged. So this recalls, I think, in my mind, the wonderful Sarah Parham, who's a food geographer at Hertfordshire University in the UK, who talks about the idea of food space as a spatial quality and local identity that's developed over many centuries and serves here in Bamberg as rural green space in the city. Now, this is my last slide, and I want to highlight that despite the strict traditions of the gardener fraternities and the pressures that they've increasingly had to bear for their land to be used for housing development in a growing city, a new alliance has cautiously but actually quite enthusiastically formed between new politically and lifestyle motivated urban gardeners who are on the left in this picture, in this composite, and the traditional gardening fraternities. And you can see them there busy on the right during the Corpus Christi procession, in which they have a special role every year. So the new gardeners have emerged from green left political groups who want to engage in healthy physical activity and who want to protect urban spaces for environmental reasons principally. But the gardener fraternities are much more conservative and skeptical of these motivations. Even so, both groups have now increasingly come to rely on each other. The new gardeners have started to rent land from retiring gardeners and are thus protecting it from development in a way. And they seek the help of those gardeners in growing locally distinct or even unique varieties, as you can see at the bottom there, the Bamberg Hörnler potato, which have always been sold to local brewery restaurants. Bamberg is famous for its brewing tradition, and it has 9 breweries in the inner city and 76 in the wider district. And these are places which in their own right are kind of guardians of local gastronomic culture. So to finish then, I'm trying to say that the traditional gardeners recognize among the new entrants very enthusiastic continuity opportunities for urban horticulture, upon which Bamberg's World Heritage status rests. So finally then, here in the heart of the city, cultural institutions, environmental functions and food production persist and evolve at the interface of innovation and tradition. And if you want to hear more details about some of the crazy traditions and governance structures, and as well as the innovations between those two, you can read about it in this paper. And I can post that round later if it's of interest. So thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is again a really excellent expose of how gardening in urban settings has a historic foot into it, and also so much even talks to politics today, engages all the community. Thank you very much for this presentation. It brings us right into contemporary times also. Now we have Filiz Özer. She's a historian, architecture historian, art historian. She will be talking about imperial gardens in the Ottoman period. And Professor Özer, Filiz, she's always able to pull up some really interesting details that speak out across so many issues. So are we connected with, so while we are preparing the slides, I wanted to say that the idea of presenting in 5 minutes, I first experienced this at a workshop at Imperial College in London. It was a workshop on the health of trees and forests. And when we were asked to present in 5 minutes, I first said, you know, this is impossible. What can I say in 5 minutes? But then, of course, there was so much conveyed, as we have also seen in these earlier presentations. Of course, they are just giving a taste of what there is. But even that little bit opens so many ideas and visually supported presentations that were beautiful so far. If it is all right for Matthew Reed, now can we hear you present your work on food citizenship, people providing food for themselves or others in their communities? Professor Matthew Reed is also from Gloucestershire University in the United Kingdom. And thank you very much.
There we are. Sorry, Akile, I lost you.
That's okay.
I lost you in cyberspace. So good afternoon, everybody, and apologies for that little technical glitch. This presentation focuses on work that my friend and collaborator Dan Keach and I have done. Dan and I work and have worked in the past mostly with commercial farmers and in the realm of commercial farming. And so we came to this work with that background, and we came with questions about food security and sustainability into an urban context where people are growing food for themselves and for their neighbors, and also trying to feed the hungry and create sustainable cities, which in some ways is a paradox when they're also people who benefit from perhaps one of the most sophisticated food systems and agricultural technologies in the world, but still feel that they need to do something else. So that's part of what our paradox was exploring and thinking about. And our focus is on the city of Bristol. And Bristol is a very interesting city in the west of England. You may have heard of it recently, as it is the place where the local people threw a statue of a slaver into the docks in a very public display of making change in your city. And city is often a very contentious place where many people disagree. Some of this disagreement has led to polarization and to people in conflict. So we were interested to see how what we describe as civic food networks actually operated in the city, and how people were using food and gardening together and exchanging food and sharing meals and helping the poor to actually start to create a slightly different city than the one that they currently existed in. So our focus, and you can see this word cloud, which we drew from their Twitter accounts. We sucked up all of their Twitter accounts and we analyzed those Twitter accounts. And so often the internet is a place where disharmony, dispute, and contention rule. But we found amongst these groups that actually what they were doing was looking after each other and affirming each other's identity. And so they had networks that were characterized by mutual support, people using food and gardening to support one another and affirm each other. So there was much positivity. If you look at those words, there are very few negative words there. There is the word love, there is the word best, there is the word cooking. People were looking after each other, even online. This was groups, and we've mentioned this already, the gendered aspect, that these groups were mostly women and they were mostly organizing in informal ways. Dan and I first noticed this when we realized that yet again, we were the only men in the room. So nobody mentioned it, but it was always an interesting feature that these were networks dominated by women. It's about small p politics, the politics of looking after one another, of looking after the city, of looking after shared spaces. And also that this is a politics not aligned with political parties and not necessarily aligned with political projects. And what we saw was groups of people on the ground, self-organizing and emerging agendas of change, that food and gardening and sharing spaces and creating beauty, but also creating things that were edible, were actually the focus of change. This has led me in particular to start talking about the idea of a food citizenship, that people wish to move beyond being consumers of food to people who actually have a stake in food and do food differently. And part of that is gardening, because gardening still remains for many, many people a route to provide some food for yourself and food for others. So it's an incredibly important thing. The pandemic and the lockdown in the UK, like I suspect in many societies, has acted as an accelerator of change. The graph here shows the number of people who report being hungry during the lockdown, and the various lockdowns and the sorts of hungers they have experienced, which in some ways is a shocking thing to think that this is the 6th most wealthy country in the world, but there is a level of precariousness. People have a risky relationship with food. Some people go hungry, other people have too much. And so we see that between 5 to 10% of the population is food insecure. And the pandemic has demonstrated that very, very clearly. Equally, it has demonstrated that many people wish to help others in their neighborhoods, helping their neighbors, helping others by volunteering and helping other people through various spontaneous community groups, but through other groups that are well established. Equally, as exactly you mentioned, Akile, there has been a rush to people's gardens, an absolute rush to start gardening and growing. I was talking to a seed merchant, which takes us back to Sir Roderick, and he was saying that they have 6 times the demand for vegetable seeds that they did before the pandemic. So keen are people to grow. But what we have is a continued focus on climate change and the importance of climate change, even through the pandemic. So people are orientating their gardening and their food to a more sustainable future, even through this dreadful time. And slowly, what I think we're seeing is a changing lexicon of food. We are talking about food differently, and we are using different words. And from that, I think we'll see some societal change. Okay, so I have one final slide, which is just where you can find the work that Dan and I have done on this. And of course, you are very welcome to drop us an email and have a chat anytime that you wish. But that's my 5 minutes, so I'm going to stop now.
Thank you very much indeed. This was again a brilliant upbringing into the present day, and how important food and gardening are tied together, and also touching upon issues like poverty or even hidden poverty in societies, even in affluent societies, and the importance of gardens. So thank you very much, and also thank you everyone for keeping up to the time. I will now again try to see if we can connect with Filiz and go to a completely different aspect of gardening, talking about imperial gardens in the Ottoman period. Filiz, are we able to connect with you? Great, okay.
Evet. Can you?
Yes. Perfect.
Yes. Perfect. Thank you. I think the problem was that everything was open before I started talking. I mean, the last presentation was open. Therefore, it is I couldn't manage to get in, but everything is now all right. So thank you very much for having me, Akile Hanım. And this is a subject very dear to my heart. So I love, of course, the gardens and gardens of Topkapı Palace, especially. Now, the Ottoman gardens were, needless to say, magnificent. They loved gardens, but not even mid, but during the 16th century, one flower came into the market, and that was the tulip. So tulips dominated most of the Ottoman gardens throughout until the end of the beginning of the 19th century. Now, as you see, this is Istanbul, early 16th century. Of course, all the pictures were miniatures, and this is the Topkapı Palace here. As you see, this is a parade ground, so there are no flowers, but the rest were full of flowers. Not only the Topkapı Palace, but the other gardens, such as this. During the 16th century, both sides of the Bosphorus were royal gardens. This was, in a way, of course, controlling the land by the, by the government. But later, during the 17th century, it will be open to public, and during the 18th century, houses will be built. This is Karabali Kabataş Palace, garden, sorry. And as you see, this is rather formal, and this drawing was done by a German traveler. They paid the gardeners to visit these gardens. There are very funny stories about the gardeners, what they thought about the European visitors, and vice versa, but we have no time to go into all that. However, tulip was first cultivated by the Ottomans. It was a wildflower, and the first cultivar, as the onion bulb, was cultivated by an Ottoman person of the 16th century. And this is a map showing the Beylik Suyu, the water supply system, and you can see through the Topkapı Palace all the tulips. Now, tulips were really holy flower. There's a reason for it, but tulips were considered the holiest of the holy flowers. And even though the rendering was stylized, as you see, there are many different versions. This is one building, and this building lacked the outer court. So there was no space to plant the magnificent garden that a mosque needs. So in effect, Sinan, the famous architect, was planting artificial flowers on the walls of the Rüstem Paşa Mosque. These are all Rüstem Paşa flowers, from blue tulips to chevron tulips and to lancet-like tulips. You name it, it is there. Ottomans loved flowers in the garden, and if a garden lacked flowers, then, of course, in vases, gardeners brought different flowers from other gardens so that the garden's flowers were replenished. This is a parade, the parade of all the guilds. This is the gardeners. And as you see, instead of bringing a garden or into the parade, they are bringing flowers in flower pots. Ottomans used artificial flowers inside the interior spaces, and out of paper they made flowers like these also. And this is just to prove that they used flowers inside flower pots. This is really the proof. This is early 16th century. This is a water pitcher and tulips inside a vase in a garden. This is 16th century. Again, this is a garden. It is replenished with vases. This is very late 16th century. Again, the same thing. And this is 18th century, cedar trees, and again, flowers in flower pots. So they really could not tolerate a garden without flowers. However, the Topkapı Palace had the first and the second court. Today, of course, if you visit the Topkapı Palace, it's all wrong because there are flowers. No, these two pictures, this is 16th century, and as you see, there are no flowers. There are reasons for that. The main reason was this building. And then the second court was the ceremonial court, almost every day, janissaries went in and out, and there were no flowers, no grass, and many a time, as you see in this picture, dignitaries went and paid homage to the Sultan, and sultans acceded the throne under this door also on a gold throne. And the other gardens were, of course, magnificently flowered, but cedar trees and plane trees were the main trees. In fact, there's a 17th century chronicler. He's not dependable on his numbers. He exaggerates tremendously when it comes to numbers, but he's very dependable when it comes to descriptions. And he tells us that the Topkapı Palace had 30,000 large trees like cedar and plane trees. However, not only that, but hundred thousands of fruit trees thrown in to the garden in between. That is a gross exaggeration, but you see the cedar trees, the plane trees, flower trees, and these are the two outer courts. And during the 18th century, the rendering of the tulip changed into this more exaggerated, more Baroque kind of rendering, but still it's the same flower. And inside the interior of the palace, you see these flowers also decorating the walls. However, this is a very interesting miniature from Walter's Museum in Baltimore. And as you see, this is 18th century Topkapı Palace, and we see the cedar trees. These are pebbles, pebble path, white pebbles and cedar trees in black pebbles. However, do you see the tulips? The same tulip. And it is very interesting to note that this was a tradition of the Ottoman palace. However, late 18th century, everything changed. Westernization started, and this is very late 18th century, early 19th century, a room used by the Queen Mother Mihrisha of the mother of Selim III. And as you see, gardens are very formal. And the remnants of the Baroque period also remain. However, everything started changing. And with this, of course, with this change, tulip will be replaced by rose. And late 19th century, not late 19th century, but later during the 1830s, an English woman, Miss Pardo, came with her father and saw the gardens of the Bosphorus. She was very much impressed. In fact, she says, it's a pity Shakespeare could not see the Bosphorus gardens before he wrote Romeo and Juliet. But she says there are magnificent roses, but unfortunately, tulips, she counts as one of the other flowers. Thank you for listening to me. And
thank you. Thank you very much, Filiz. This was really, it showed again so much beauty and so much structured design for the gardens, again, in his historical times. I wish we could have kept some of these the way they are, but life, it's impossible, I think.
Unfortunately not. Unfortunately not.
Now, if I may, I would like to ask Pat Thompson who's in the field of education, and she has recently co-authored a book on why garden in schools, looking into really fascinating openings as the meanings we attach to gardens. So if I may, please, Pat, could I ask you to come in and talk about your findings?
Yep, absolutely. I'm just turn my video on. Thank you very much for the invitation. People in education, can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you very well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. People in education often don't get asked to these kinds of events, so I'm very pleased to have been invited. And I really want to make one kind of argument, and just do a kind of rapid whistle tour of school gardens. And gardens have been in schools for a very long time, in fact, for far longer than schools were actually compulsory. And there are records of school gardens in the writings, for example, of Comenius, who saw gardening as a kind of separate subject, strongly tied to religious instruction. And gardens were often places where children could learn a range of things together, sort of the moral virtues of hard work, the healthy benefits of being outside and physical exercise, the wonders of nature. But people also saw that gardens presented an opportunity to learn language, science and maths, for example. And Froebel, whose little garden is actually at the bottom left of this illustration, Froebel is the inventor of the term kindergarten, or kindergarten as it translates into English, saw the garden not simply as a metaphor, but actually as a material practice. And all of his curriculum in the early years of schooling were in fact designed the outside activities were designed in and for a garden. Gardening really took off in schools in the 19th century, but it still had sort of multiple purposes. Towards the end of the 19th century, vocational learning was added into the garden curriculum. Gardening was still seen as a separate subject, but it was also seen as a place where children could learn the principles of natural selection, and that was often tied to a kind of set of beliefs related not simply to science, but also colonial beliefs about natural selection as well. And gardens, in fact, often tied into the interests in schooling, in the interests of the nation state. And of course, as an Australian, I think very much of an Australian example at the time of Federation, which was at the beginning of the 20th century. Australian schools were encouraged to stop planting British plants and to start planting Australian natives, and preferably establish a garden in the shape of the new map of Australia. And during both world wars, school gardens were really important for food growing. And that's still the case in majority world development contexts, where school gardens are an important part not only of feeding children, they're often part of feeding programs, but it's also a way to encourage through children families who've been uprooted from their kind of agricultural villages and now live in townships. It's a way of encouraging them to go back to growing food as well. And they're very extensive feeding programs in a lot of countries, often sponsored by multinational companies and international aid. However, gardens are often struggle to find a place in the curriculum. Gardening has moved from being a kind of separate subject, except in senior years where it might still appear as a vocational subject. And early on, it got separated from nature study. So nature study is linked very strongly to science, but gardens have actually really struggled to find a kind of an attachment in the school. And in a way, the kind of nature study school garden split is a version of the kind of wilderness versus cultivation, or conservation versus cultivation sort of discourse, which still I think appears in schooling even though people are attempting to bring it back together. A lot of today's school gardens are linked to nutrition and concerns about health, particularly obesity. They're also linked to what my colleague Lexi and I called a foodie discourse, which is a lot of school gardens are now sponsored by celebrity chefs, and they're linked to the discourses of grow local, eat local. And what they tend to ignore is two things. Firstly, they ignore the kind of questions of food poverty. And secondly, they ignore very often the kinds of local knowledges that exist within communities about gardening. And it's often these programs that are sponsored by chefs, for example, Alice Waters' program, and at the bottom right here, Stephanie Alexander's program in Australia, import horticultural knowledge as if no knowledge actually exists without it coming in with them. The other way that gardens appear is in the kind of eco schools movement. So it's connected to sustainability education. And sustainability education also struggles to find a place in the school curriculum. It's sometimes linked to geography, it's sometimes linked to science. Occasionally in primary schools, it might be seen as a separate subject, particularly in those schools that are part of and have collected a little decal as an eco school. And there are, of course, a range of practical problems related to school gardens, which map onto the kind of knowledge difficulties that there are. And it's the kind of interdisciplinarity and the possibility of gardens actually being used for multiple purposes, which paradoxically have actually led to them having a kind of fragile connection with compartmentalised subjects. And what we argue in our book is that actually school gardens do best when they're strongly connected and legitimated by external events such as world wars or the need for feeding programs, or they have strong external support, as in the case of Alice Waters' Kitchen Garden program in California, which is linked not simply to concerns about nutrition, but to a statewide lunch program. So it's actually got an outside school systemic support. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is such an important contribution. Again, I think a very significant, and as you say, very often a kind of neglected aspect of gardening. What you talked about also maybe made me think of a movement in the 1930s in Turkey of having village institutes where children were taught extensively how to use the soil, and that's of course another topic in itself, but thank you very much for this most valuable contribution. Now, if I could have Roberto Briceno Leon, who will be joining us from another continent. I hope you are still with us, Roberto. I saw you, yes.
Yes. Hi,
yes.
Achille.
Hi, Roberto. Very good to see you.
Nice to share this with you too.
Yes. Roberto Briceno Leon, he's in Latin America. He was the head of the Sociological Association of Latin America. And his speciality really is on violence and the demographic changes, particularly of the young male population linked to violence. But today he will be tying this issue of violence and security to garden designs. And so I will leave the floor to you, Roberto.
Thank you very much, Achille. It's a pleasure to be with you and this seminar. What I want to talk today to you is about the changes in the place of the gardens in the houses and in the city in Latin America, and how that changes are related with the changes in the society. The Latin American city, colonial city, didn't have trees or gardens. It's a street. Usually it's really cities without gardens, you know? And walking in the street, you can see only stones, gray, and some woods in the windows, but nothing more. No, there are no traces of natural green on the cities, no, in the colonial cities. But this could be a misleading impression, because from the air there is an opposite. They were really green cities. The point is where the gardens are located. No? The cities, due to the weak status and not really lighting in the cities, the lack of safety and protection, they were like fortress. The cities are compact in the city in order to defend themselves and the families. No, and this was the idea with the planning of the city by the Spanish kingdom and the Philip II orders about how to build the cities. No, but the only that we can see is the windows, the doors, but inside the houses there are plenty of gardens. They are open. The houses are open inside, and the interior patio, we call in Spanish, the gardens are decorative with painting, mills, and so they are really, the greens in the cities are inside of the houses. The modern houses use the patio to combine the ornamental function with the provision of the foods, the herbs that they're using for medical purposes. The largest houses, the people, the better off, they have two interior spaces. One is more formal, and the second is more dedicated to the family, the kitchen, the pigs, well, to the food properly. But all that, it happens inside the house. No, toward the streets, they are only sobriety, but inside is the pleasure of the garden. This situation changed in the beginning of the 20th century due to several aspects, cultural, ideological, the architectural influence, but also to the strong states, the increase of the public safety, the beginning of the lightning in the city, and that imposed the model of the garden city that you know. And the gardens changed from inside the house to the outside of the house, you know, and became part of the city. And that created new areas in the city where the people, the better off, moved and the suburbs. And that is what is interesting. It does happen later to all social sectors, not only for the elite that originally moved outside the city, but for all social sectors. No? And the house was built up in the middle of the property, like an island. And the garden that was inside turned to outside. And that changed completely the city and the place of the garden. No? But then, and this is paradoxical, the insecurity in the last 30 years, the insecurity increased in Latin America. Latin America is the region with the highest homicide rates in the world. Let's say there are countries with 50, 70 times more homicide than Europe countries or Asian countries as well. And then the cities became closed, the exterior gardens, no, and built up walls against, no, and that is changed the city and the space of the city, the place of the gardens in the city completely. But there are these changes. My interpretation, and with that I finish, is that due to this, the safety in the city, the strong states, and the lightning in the city. The second is the changes in the family. Then the traditional expanded family became nuclear families, and therefore it required less space in the house, and the house become smaller than the previous ones for all social sectors. No? And the family life also changes. Traditionally, the Latin American family was more living inside, inwards, no? And then move it to outward. It was a change also in a value in the society and the culture that changed the protection of the private to a value that showing oneself in the public. No? And well, finally, also practical function changed from the garden dedicated to the family consumption to a garden dedicated to the ornamental, decorative, and prestigious function. So the gardens changed in the Latin American house and city from the inner social life to the outer social life. Well, this is my small contribution to the...
Yeah. Thank you very much, Roberto. This was really fascinating, and indeed something I had not thought of before you came up with the title of the presentation. Thank you very much. This is a great contribution again, another one. So now, if I may, go to my colleague Marcel, who we share the same department. Marcel, would you like to make your presentation on gardens, new garden formations in Czechoslovakia?
Hello, thank you. Yes, I would love to. I'm trying to share the slides. And
yeah. Marcel is also of Czech origin, but also he's been living in Turkey for so long that probably has two identities.
Yeah, several. Yes. So once again, thank you, and hello to everyone. And it's really a great pleasure to be here. Also, I'm from hosting institution, but I don't know. Can you see and can you hear me?
Yes,
can
we
you
can see you.
I just cannot, because we have this HPs and there. Okay. So there should be full screen, and you should see something like about some significance of gardens, hopefully. I think I will be in the strand with Dan and Matt. I will be talking more about this like social aspect of gardens and about not those beautiful artistic gardens. That's one that Mr. Garrett helped to build, and now he's taking care of it. More these vegetable or these kitchen gardens that have roots already in, since the beginning probably, but especially if you think about this medieval era and the smallest owners, the farmers that they were called, I know we are kind of like German speaking space at the time, Bohemia, Moravia. And to make it more complicated, just small note, and I should have been, of course, watching my time, of course. Oh, please tell me if I overstep these 5 minutes. That's the only thing I'm very afraid and shy about. That I'm from Slovakia, so Slovak. I grew up in Moravia, and I'm Czech citizen, and I'm living in Turkey for last 12 years. So to make it more, so in these rural areas, we can speak of the small vegetable gardens. I found names as a potager or potager and kitchen garden as a type, as a term. And this evolves from old family farm plots. So, and then we go to urban areas with the industrialization. So of course, people migrate to cities, and of course, by part they are hungry. Also, they work for 12 to 16 hours, isn't it, per day? We are in Europe, and of course, the very beginning is in Great Britain, in the UK, and especially England, probably, I suppose, of this industrialization. And Bohemia, Moravia would be then this Austrian Empire at the time. Especially German-speaking regions, for example, like Sudetenland, they started these first small gardening, these colonies, again, more like for the vegetables, for this food for the people or for, for the family. And by part, maybe there could be this artistic, this aesthetic, this beautiful garden that Mr. Garrett was speaking about. That when I saw it, I was fascinated totally, really. And I was so happy to hear about also the beetles and all these insects, and especially bees, because, for example, in my country, bees at the moment, they have some kind of specific, let's say, call it plague. Let's say they have had COVID, like now we have for some last maybe 2 decades, and they are in fact dying out. So if the good gardens will save that this beautiful animal that gives us honey, it will be awesome. So we can see here that gardens function as kind of environmental solution for greener cities. Again, we can go back to especially England with the work of Ebenezer Howard in 19th century, these green cities. So we totally do the same thing in Central Europe. Copy, we learn, exchange probably, and then of course this view of nutritional or food source solutions. So for this better quality of living in urban space, and for more or less upper classes, or if it's being public, then we have these beautiful artistic gardens that Sir Floud and Mr. Garrett were talking about. Yes, gardens that I'm showing you some factory, but this is a Ringhofer factory in Smíchov, Praha, in Prague. And in fact, this Mr. Ringhofer, this owner, he rented some allotments, some small plots to his own employees. And this is kind of beginning of this public allotment gardens, like in Czech-speaking areas, we can say. So Prague, of course, was also German, also of course Czech city, but it's capital of course Czech Republic. That's for the last 90 years, let's say. And so you can imagine that somewhere in the front, probably there would be these allotments, and that they built it in 1890s. But he rented it, by the way. He didn't give it to them. So yes, Mr. Ringhofer had still money, and by the name we see, it was a German owner. Then, if I skip to already, Czechoslovakia, so there was World War I, and many little countries appeared, same like on the, say, this aftermath of both Austrian or also Ottoman Empire. So we have Czechoslovakia. It's a kind of project that we've had between 1918 and 1993 in Central Europe. And here we can talk of 3. Of course, I'm talking about research that is, of course, based on people who really work on this in Czech Republic. So that they noticed this, that there's a garden cities for affluent upper class. An example would be this Spořilov, something like sparing place, it means in translation. In 1925, we call this period First Republic, same like, for example, here we call it the Revolution period of Republic in Turkey. So interesting here really is they speak of those who study this, of course, especially cultural geographers would mention Petr Gibas, for example, from Prague, from the Charles University. That you see here this, and I cannot now see my own slide, by the way, because there's anyway. So this this arts and crafts movement. So you can see this is the gardening city. There were gardens again, same like Professor Briseño was showing that inside, behind the houses, there were the gardens. Of course, it's a tiny photograph. I hope you can at least guess what is it about. And now we have, after garden colonies that are this more middle class or working class garden plots, then we have this emergency colony, something like for the most impoverished people. Examples in Prague, although I'm from Brno, it's just weird to show Prague, but Pod Bohudalcem and na Slatince, the places, and look, they either look today like this former emergency colony, so really small plots of gardens, really you wanted to grow there just vegetables, and it was really for the lower classes, not so affluent people, again, working class mostly. So either they are kind of not taken care of and look like this, or they are nicely, you can say maybe gentrified in a way, as this to the right, it's Shed Muslim, so before bridge, and the other one is named politically.
Diyor ki kendi slaytları.
Okay, so this is Czechoslovakia, you probably know, and what I can say that there are some nicer places. And first founded colonies, this, let's say, middle class colonies, you know, this it range Libensky Ostrov, so it's Liben Island, it means, which means that on Moldau or Vltava River, there's literally small island, and Ořechovka is very center of the Prague. And nowadays, again, there were more like garden cities, again, that people had villas and gardens. Socialism comes in 1948, and we enjoyed this period till 1989. Some people really did, some people of course did not. But what happened, that there was a change in this private property. So you didn't have private property, you could only have mostly personal property, which means apartment. You can have a cottage, you know, something, a car, you know, automobile. You couldn't own a field, for example, so like, you know, some immobile property or a shop. So people had to always be organized. It's organized modernity, as we say in sociology. And they found this Czechoslovak Union of Gardeners, fruit growers. Now, I'm sorry, I'm not sure, of course, so much about the proper terminology. This is what I found. Fruit growers is interesting. And they were organized into this in 60s. We had longer this leisure time and shorter, of course, working week, so 5 days, not 6, and 8 hours, so 40 hours a week. If you remember, at the same time it happens in the Western Europe, same in our Europe, you know, behind the Iron Curtain. So in 1960, this happens in Czechoslovakia. There's since Second World War problem with food. For example, in 1946, we are saved by Soviet Union that they send us, I don't know how many million tons of grain, you know, wheat. On the other hand, millions of people die in Ukraine. I'm very sorry about it, and this happened historically. So people see that we have maybe 1 can of something, some conserve, of some meat conserve, 1 can of jam or honey, and we need to grow something. So a huge motivational factor, I would say, is to grow something is this insufficiency of the socialist economy. That's why you can see that there are 676 garden allotment colonies already in late 1950s, because we have this gardening union, and it grows, increases up to 4,477 of such garden colonies before 1989, with 450 members. And I'm talking about 15 million country, 50 million, you know, people like as a population. And one example I wanted to give, since Sir Flav was talking about this economic effect, luckily I found this just this morning, by the way. The economic effect was, for example, that I would say these folk gardeners in that time provide for in 66 tons of fruit. So for us, mostly it will be apples, of course, maybe some pears, maybe some peaches, something like that, mostly. In 1979, so in this deep normalization that I will explain what it is, to the people, that they literally then bring it and sell it, of course, for some lower price to the shops. Again, everything is owned by the state. Everything is socialist, of course. We never had communism.
Thank you very much, Marcel. I think
did I
maybe round up?
Really?
I think we
Okay,
have 5
I'm not able
minutes
to make
over.
it. Okay.
So we will listen to you again at another time. But
another time. So I will just finish with this: that this was this normalization where people were escaping to privacy because they shut us down. This again from Moscow, and we were running from this, and that was the sociological point I wanted to make. And now they are sometimes closing some colonies that has these beautiful green old gardens, and this I wanted to compare. This is when it looks something between the vegetable and this artistic, nice aesthetic garden. So thank you so much. This is Ořechovka in Prague, by the way.
Thank you.
Where we escape.
Again, so interesting, and one really has an appetite to hear more about what you are saying. Absolutely fascinating, and as you say, reinforces Matt's and Dan's messages about gardening. Thank you. And now we have, before we open for general discussion, we have Mary Jo Del Veico from Harvard University and Sadek Rahimi, again, who's a psychiatrist. And I think we have to arrange Mary Jo's slides in the way she would like them to be. So could we first hear Sadek Rahimi's very interesting, I'm sure, presentation on the garden as spatial representation of intimate exteriority in Persian culture. If this is all right for you, to have Sadek talk first, and then we will have Mary Jo before we open the floor to questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Akila Hanım.
Yeah.
It's really great to be a part of this event, even though my expertise and specialties is not on gardens, but this concept of the extimity, which I will explain in a second what it means, is a way that gardens really become kind of related to the bulk of the work that I've been doing in the last couple of decades, I guess. But in addition to that, there is another interest for me, which is a very personal interest. I grew up in Iran, and as a child, this notion of gardens inside gardens, which comes very close to what our friend Roberto was referring to in the Latin American context and so on, is very personal. So I grew up with this, and I have I spent the majority of my time in gardens at home, which is the quote-unquote Persian garden, this surrounded walled garden inside the house, and a larger one that my dad used to hold. Like that wasn't enough for him, so he had a second one outside, which very similar to home, but the same structure, but much larger. In any case, so the notion of garden is important and personal to me, but also intellectually significant. Not to mention the Persian garden that I will be addressing here is also identified as an important cultural contribution from the Iranian history. It's on the on UNESCO's World Heritage List. The general notion of it. So let me tell you the gist of what I want to say, and then I'll open it up. The idea of the Persian garden is generally accepted that it comes to represent, it's a symbolic representation of heaven. As was mentioned earlier, the word paradise, for example, is a Persian word that has come to stand for paradise, but it still exists in current day Persian as well. You can use it both to mean garden or to mean the Garden of Eden, or the paradise. So recently, this notion of garden has become very popular for reasons that are kind of beyond me. I'm not sure why. And there's a lot of academic work of interpretation and so on, especially in social sciences. And but what has been highly focused in these works, in this research, has been the walledness of it. So it's generally, like I said, agreed, everybody, that yes, it represents, originally it comes to represent heaven, some kind of heaven on earth. But then the focus has, when it comes to interpreting it from social science, cultural, and so on points of view, is on the fact that it's walled, kind of like what Roberto was telling us, that it's separated from the outside world, and it's kept inside. So there are two type of major interpretations out there that are, have a lot of currency. One is what I would call the Zahir Batin point of view, and I'll just explain. My friends who speak Turkish know that these terms, obviously, they come from Arabic. And the other is Mahram, Na-Mahram point of view or interpretation. The Zahir and the Batin, again, for those of you who don't know the words, can be translated, generally speaking, into the appearance and the substance or the interior, right? That's been a very major interpretation that has been very broadly applied to the Persian culture to begin with. Definitely applied to the Persian garden, so to speak, but then expanded from there to describe how Iranians, like what is the national characteristic of Iranians, referring to the idea that, through centuries and thousands of years of living under, despotic systems and so on, they have developed this sense of having an inside world that is very different from the outside world. What you do outside is not necessarily the same or even related to what you do inside. Now, in recent days, you can see it also it is repeated a lot in the media in terms of, for example, the Islamic rules, the Islamic regime in Iran, and how women especially have this code of conduct outside and so on. They all, but then inside their homes, it's a completely different reality and so on. So this is a manifestation of that very broad and general kind of interpretation, or rather, I don't know, characterization of the Persian or Iranian, what would you call it, cultural selfhood, so that's very common, and it's taken on also within Iran and so on, and definitely a good amount of truth to that as well. The other one that is more recent, so to speak, it has more of a religious kind of side to it, more of a religious tendency to it, which is what I call the mahram and no-mahram interpretation, which goes back to the Islamic terms, mahram and no-mahram. I don't know if there's a great translation for these. If anybody here is familiar and can help me, that would be great for these words, mahram and no-mahram in English. But the basic idea is mahram is those people within the kinship system who are close enough to a woman for whom the woman is not required, or in front of whom the woman is not required to cover, use hijab and so on. And by that same token, who are also taboos, so that the woman cannot marry these individuals. Obviously, it refers mainly to the male-female kind of interactions. And no-mahram is, on the other hand, the woman has to cover and have hijab, but then has the freedom to marry them. So obviously, these are very big, kind of concepts, and a lot can be said about them, but that's the gist of it, as far as I understand them. And so this is the other approach that has been lately applied, especially within Iran, to this idea of that, yes, that's what the Persian garden stands for. There's this wall of privacy that only the mahram, and of course then this goes on to have a lot of both of these notions that I just referred to have religious, philosophical, a lot of and social, psychological, political interpretation and expansions on these that they bring in. So I know I'm sorry, Akila Hanum, I wasn't following the time. So you tell me when I reach the limit. I try in my mind to have my inner clock.
Thank you very much.
Oh, am I done?
Yeah.
Can I take one more minute?
Yes, please.
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up very quickly because I haven't said my point yet. Sorry. My point is that these two interpretations, what is unfortunate about them is that their focus, they zoom in on the wall as a separator, simply, which is an element, obviously, in this model of the Persian garden, but it's only that, one element. And so what they focus on is that it is a way of separating the inside from the outside. However, this notion, what is more important about that is that it's also a way of bringing the outside into the inside. So that's the aspect that is often absent in a lot of interpretations, but I think is also very, very important. It's kind of came in through some of the conversations here, specifically Roberto's. and that's the notion that in psychoanalysis, is the term extimity, which is a combination, is a coined word, a combination of external intimacy, right? And the idea that it kind of, again, it has very vast roots, goes against the basic ontological notion of separating being from non-being, right? Inside from the outside, and so on. And how by bringing the outside and enclosing it within, it's basically, this notion is at the same time is a reflection of the simultaneous presence of, again, the paradise, that which is lost, that bliss, that original connection, union, whatever way you like to think of the paradise, that is now absent, or nature, if you like, that goes away in making cities and buildings and so on. And it's a way of keeping that reference symbolically alive and making it a part of our architectural structure, our civil structure. I can stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This was again fascinating. And from the garden, we go into psychiatry and psychoanalysis. So it's really the way we could approach gardens and designs. There's so many aspects. Thank you very much, Sad, for bringing these points. And now I think we should be set with the organization of Professor Mary Jo Del Vecchio Good's presentation. She's in social medicine. She's a colleague and anthropologist from Harvard University. So please, Mary Jo.
Thank you very much, Akile. Antonio's slides are somewhere else. Oh, there we go. Okay. So I'm speaking as a student, and this was the most refreshing conference I have been to, with extraordinary presentations, and I thank you all. So I'm speaking first with Antonio's slide here. We were talking about, when we were realizing we needed to be commenting on what was happening today, about the importance of the healing aspect of gardens and the importance of having these gardens in places such as hospitals. And so this Antonio is not only a psychiatrist, he's also head of geriatric psychiatry. These are places that people can actually go to heal. And the concept of the open space and the garden in the hospital is one that is comes also from Frederick Olmsted. If I could have my slides too. Let's see, can we go down through Antonio's slides here and go to mine? Okay. I wish I had the benefit of the garden artist Fergus Garrett to take care of my garden. But I'm also thinking about the kind of spaces that gardens mean for gathering. Olmsted designed the emerald necklace for Boston, Central Park, and many, many other parks after he was 43 years old. In the mid 1800s, he was first head of what became the Red Cross during the Civil War, and that drove him into madness. He came out of that period and went into what he called landscape architecture. And the healing benefits of being in the garden were also connected to his sense of what democracy meant. And so he wanted to create spaces in which everyone in a particular society, whether it be New York City or the greater Boston area, could come together and have the multitude of people from various different social classes coming together for a sense of common good. But also, it grew out of transcendentalism, 19th century transcendentalism ideology about citizenship and about individualism, and also about the divine in nature. So seeing divine in nature was also connected to the sense of healing, from the clamor of the industrial city to the calm of being in public space, not walled space. And thinking about the presentations today, I had this thought about what did the pandemic do in terms of the flight to privacy that Roberto and Marcel and others talked about, the walled city of Sadek, the walled gardens and so on, and then these open gardens. So I put up this slide of my garden in 2019 in May and my garden now. This is outside the house. This is not the enclosed space. My courtyard would be filled with people at this time of year, with parties and gatherings. And we would just simply walk through the rhododendron and go into the courtyard, which is, plantings and stones, but also places to sit. With the pandemic, I set up a place for us to meet outside my walled courtyard and outside of the constrictions of an interior which brought the virus. And I think that I would just like to reference a paper by Carol Nicholson on Olmsted, who took 1,100 acres of land in the Boston area to make the necklace, the emerald necklace, and designed that. And he considered it to be one of his most important structures, not structures, one of his most important public gardens and walkways and pathways. And it's it is very wild. It is the opposite of the Persian garden. It is the opposite of many of these other gardens, but it is closer to the gardens that Fergus Garrett showed us in great beauty. I wish I had wildflowers growing in my front yard instead of grass. Thank you very much, Akile.
Thank you very much, Mary Jo. This was, again, it was food for thought, even tying up gardens with democracy and other concepts of society. Now I see that we have really spent so much time that we do not have time to go for second rounds, but I will ask maybe first of all if for 5 minutes, if anyone has any questions to each other among our speakers. And then I would like to ask our audience who have been listening, I see very diligently. Would anyone like to make any comments or ask any questions, or if there's anything that you feel you didn't have time to mention, now is maybe the time to bring it up. If you remember, we started with Sir Roderick Cloud's economic analysis of the garden, and then moved on to subsistence gardening and what it means for societies, and to the aesthetics of gardens. So any questions or comments from anyone? Our discussant, Huri Cihan İslamoğlu, she's an economic historian in the process of writing a book on world history. She is maybe, she would like to say something. She was not feeling all that well today, but I know she had some very impressive stories of gardens in Afghanistan, even during the civil war, when everything was so militarized and people had to move in military vehicles. And in the middle of all of this war atmosphere would be rose gardens where people had the chance to sit and communicate with each other, some very cherished rose gardens. So we see gardens really in the middle of even the most adverse times as coming as refreshing reminders that nature can be so beautiful. And indeed, in this 2-hour session, we have really had the chance to see some very, very beautiful expressions of how humans are using nature to make beauty out of it. So now I would like to open the floor for questions. Does anyone have any questions?
I can ask a question if possible.
Pınar Garba, yes, please, Pınar, go ahead.
Firstly, I would like to thank you all for this magnificent presentations so that I can understand different aspects of gardening, which as an urban sociologist, I'm not very familiar of. So, and that brought me to the idea of imagining a new order, actually. So when we consider all these networks enabling the wild nature shaking hands with the organized nature, as Mr. Garrett mentioned, or when we think of the different organizations of people around gardens, can we imagine a positive backstep from the idea of urban as an opposition to nature? Or to put it in different words, can we imagine a progress from the green edges of the cities to the core, a green transformation? So do gardens allow us such a green idea of reproduction of urban environments? So I would like to ask that.
Mm-hmm. Anyone who would like to comment on this question? Yes, please, Matt. Yes.
Thank you. I've just seen that Dan had raised his hand, so I was going to tell him to speak. But I will speak ahead of him. I just think to say that I think we live at a moment when people are really thinking about what urbanism means, and the modern form of urbanism, which has seen us rationalize space in different ways. So we've had a rationalization of space that we have called urban, and a rationalization of space that we have called rural, and we have assigned to those different spaces different functions. I think that's breaking down, and I think that needs to break down for purposes of sustainability. That urban areas have become very challenged with livability, and we know that things like street trees and green spaces, and we've just heard very eloquently from Mary Jo about the importance of spaces and gardens as meeting places. I think all of those things are breaking down. I think that the demands of an ecological system, such as things like managing floodwater, managing human waste, are actually going to become part of the new infrastructure. So we're going to have a greener infrastructure that has to work. And then I look to things like the Bosco Verticale in Italy, you know, the tower block that grows trees, which is a provocation. It's an architectural provocation. And it sort of spoke very profoundly to me to what Sadek was saying about the recovery of nature and the recovery of paradise in an urban area. But I think we're in a new phase of how urban areas will become green. I think the other challenge we will see is that rural areas will become urban in new ways. and that will be another challenge. But I think we live at that moment, and I think our job as sort of social scientists and scholars is to try and do that thoughtfully, so it's not just something that's left to the hands of corporations or people being driven by those kind of motivations, that we think about a common interest and a common good.
Thank you. This was a very good point to make, and of course we have a lot to hope for the future of urban spaces.
Can I just make a historical comment, which is that when Thomas More wrote his great book Utopia in the 16th century, he envisaged that the citizens of Utopia would all have gardens, and they would, each street in Utopia would compete with other streets for the best fruit and vegetables in production. So we can associate urban gardens with utopia.
Yes, thank you very much. That's, I think, a very telling.
And could I just add something, Akila Hanım, to that, to what Matt said, which I'm very much involved with a number of schemes that involve urban situations, especially with Dr. Nigel Dunnett of Sheffield University, who has played a part in the Greater Green scheme at Sheffield, and we're trying to do something in our sort of city just down the road from us, which has been very well received. But very interestingly, what we're doing is that it's not just about creating beautiful public realm plantings that are low maintenance but are diverse, but we're working alongside ecologists, entomologists who are doing biodiversity audits throughout the town and city, and then looking at the sort of the land, the wild land beyond it, and trying to connect everything up, so that there's also, you know, the well-being aspect of it, there's the beautification aspect of it, but there's a biodiversity aspect of it as well, and looking at every space, you know, every space, and making sure that you make that. You make something significant out of it, but it's led by the science of what's in the city, what should be, and the biodiversity element of it. So that's the sort of complex arrangement. And the biggest problem with that is getting local authorities to think in a different way. And so it's going to take a bit of time before this happens, but just them to switch over the way they're thinking, because there's transport involved, etc., all of that. But I think, just as Matt said, it is happening, and it doesn't need to be as extreme as what Laura Gatti is doing with Bosco Verticale. I mean, that's extraordinary what she's doing. It doesn't need to be as extreme as what the rewilding projects that we're getting around sort of places like Knepp and so on. That certainly there can be a movement in these sort of urban conurbations that will make things happen.
Thank you very much indeed. I think this has been a really extraordinary session, definitely for me. It brought to heart many issues that are behind our research agenda. I thank you all very much. I'm being warned that our time is now, it has come to an end, 2 hours. But I would like to first thank all our speakers very much indeed for the excellent talks that you gave. And I hope that we will meet again and maybe also transfer all of these ideas maybe into print if you are all willing to do that. But thank you very much again, and I look forward to meeting again. Thank you. I will say goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Akila Hanım.
Thank you. Thank you for your time and all your work. Teşekkür ederim.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Roberto.
Teşekkür ederim.
Teşekkür ederim, Mary Jo.